Please bear with my computer. I have 4 gigabytes of RAM, and things are going to start getting slow. So I'm going to teach functional React, which is a relatively new concept. It was introduced about a year ago. Before then, React used to be class-based, but there's been some like optimization benefits for using functional React behind the scenes, and that's what I got used to. So that's what I'm going to teach you guys. And I'm going to start pretty simple, and then we're going to get into the more like concrete features of it. So the very first thing, and the thing that scares a lot of people, is JSX. JSX is like this hybrid HTML JavaScript language that can be quite scary. So this is a JavaScript file, right? And then in here you have what looks like HTML. The thing to note here, and the thing that I always keep in the back of my mind, is that this is JavaScript. It gets compiled into JavaScript. Everything here is JavaScript. Like these divs, when they run through a compiler, usually Webpack or Babylon or something, sorry, not Babylon, they will turn into create element functions, which is a basic JavaScript thing, right? Document.create element, and that's all they turn into. So behind the scenes, these are all just like basic JavaScript. This is just simpler syntax so that you can structure larger apps. So yeah, that's JSX. There's not much more to it. You just got to keep remembering that at the end of the day, this is all just JavaScript. So there's no actual HTML here. So we can get into the main thing about React, which is components. So instead of just having one HTML page, which is huge, and then you have a bunch of like event listeners that are looking for different things, and then updaters, you have to keep track of a bunch of like document.getElement by ID, document.getElement by ID, and then you have to keep track everything. This is the benefit of React. Because your HTML, again JavaScript, is inside of the same file, you can do everything in place. And then you can also group HTML blocks together. So a little bit about, like, if you guys are questioning, like, how does this become HTML? So this is like your parent element here, and this is the first thing that happens in React. It will render, this is the parent, it will render the parent into an actual document, into something that's in your HTML file, which is right here, right? So this is the only HTML that you need in your React app, because that's the thing that it will parent onto. And then everything else just gets treed down from this one div. So that's it. We don't ever touch indexes anymore, because that's all just compiled away. We just deal with our sources. So yeah, that's a little bit about components. We can actually just start running this. So this is a dev server that's running in the background, and we can see what it looks like. So we can see this is, you know, actual HTML that was compiled from this, right? And it has the same structure. There's a div, and it has a p tag in it, and this has a class. Just a little React quirk: classes are renamed to class name because class is a reserved keyword, you know, a class. So you can add anything in here, like basic HTML tags like IDs or like style or whatever. But then we can create other components that we can nest. So this is another file, and in it I created a new function which will return a new like React element. So this should create a div with that's called that has an ID footer, and inside of it it'll create a p tag that says I am the footer, right? So then you can take this component. So this is called a component, and it's inside of the components folder, and you can render this in your app. So in our app we can import it. Right, so I'm just importing the footer here. And then the way we can render this onto our app is we can go into our JSX and we can call the footer or create a footer like we would an HTML item. And so the difference here is that it's a capital letter. And this is kind of like convention, which indicates that this isn't a basic HTML item. This is something that you've created. This is a component. This is one of your components. So now if we refresh the server, we can see down here, I am the footer, right? And that wasn't there before, just in case you guys missed it. So this is components. You just create a bunch of subcomponents and then bigger components. And this is, like if you go on a big website, you can think about how to make things into components. Like, let's go to YouTube. I don't think YouTube uses React, but anyway, you can think about this search box as a component, right? This nav is a component here. All of these videos themselves are individual components, which are then grouped together into a larger component, which is the recommended sections, right? And you can see, like, you can try and imagine this nesting that's happening. This top bar is probably a component, right? And that's how you can make things into components. So the next thing, we can go into our props. So this is how you can pass information between components, and it's a really important and useful feature. So in this footer here, again, we can declare things like class name and stuff, or ID, right? But we can also declare variables almost that aren't HTML things. So for example, let's create something called the message, right? And we will say, I don't know, hello, right? So this isn't an HTML thing, right? There is no HTML type hello or message, right? But so this becomes a prop. And inside of here, again, remember, this is just a function. It's just a normal JS function. So we can receive this, whatever the input is. So here we can receive the props input. And I guess to start with, let's just log it, right? Let's see what props looks like. And if we go here, we can see that props is an object and it has a message field. And notice this message field is exactly what we passed in, right? So we can do something like props.message and that would just say whatever the message was. But something else that we can do with JSX here is we can insert JavaScript into what looks like HTML, but remember, it's not HTML. So let's just put it at the end here. So if we open and close curly braces, we are saying that whatever is in here should be rendered into like text, even though it might be JavaScript. So here we can do props.message, right? And what will happen here is it will take the value of props.message and it will render it into text. So here we can see this word hello comes from that prop. So yeah, that's a little bit about props. You can pass items in and out. And it's not just, simple variables that you can pass in. We can pass in more complicated things. For example, we can pass in event handlers. So inside of this function, we can create a sub-function, and I'm just going to use short names so I don't have to type out lots. Right, so let's say we create this event handler that will console the event, right? And then in here, we can say event handle, and we can pass it a function inside of JavaScript. So we can pass it a pointer to this function. So if we pass it this E, and we go into here, let's just create a button. So this is a normal HTML element, and buttons usually have onClicks, right? So in this onClick, again, we can use JavaScript to say, when this onClick event happens, run this piece of code. This is the equivalent of passing in a function. And then here, we can do props.e. So this will take the parent's event handler, and it will call it as part of this child. So we'll give this button some text so that it doesn't look tiny. And, oh, apparently I broke it. Oh, that's true, yeah. Event, yeah, she's right. So, not an expert, almost. So yeah, event handle is the name we gave it, so that's the thing that we're going to call. Let's see if that works, hopefully, yeah. So we can see like the event item that's passed in. So yeah, props can be anything. They can be normal JSX or they can be functions that you pass in. So with React, there's this concept of rendering and re-rendering that happens all the time. So anytime things change, you want to maybe re-render a component. Like let's say a counter happens and it increments or something. You want to re-render things. And for that, functional React has introduced states. So state used to be a thing in the original version of React, but it's a little bit changed in the newer versions of React. So here we can go from React and we can import, so they're called hooks, and there's a few offered by default. There's use state and use effect. I'll go over use effect in a little bit, but for now let's just stick with use state. So a use state is a function that will return two parameters, or like two variables when you call it. So here we're going to, let's create a state item called count, and the other thing, so count will become just a normal variable. And the other thing it will return is a function you call when you want to change the counter, or the count, the variable. So usually this is called change, and then the name of the variable. And then we can use state, and we can pass it, we can leave it blank, or we can pass it an initial value, so 0, let's say. And then we can use count in our JSX here. So at the end here, let's just do count, and then in JavaScript, we can render this into a variable. So there we go, count is 0. And if I change what this initial is, it will become whatever that is, right? So now if we, let's just do a set timeout, 1 second, and then we do, let's say count equals to count plus 1, right? So you might think that by incrementing count, this would cause this counter to update. But that won't really happen because it's not triggering a re-render. This is the purpose of states, is that you want only things that cause state updates to re-render, because if you don't, then anytime any variable changes, React has to just account for that and re-render anyway, which is a lot of wasted computation. So the way that we can change this to cause re-render is we can actually use that function that it gave us. This function, if you use that function instead, so change count, count plus 1. So we're sending it, so we're saying change the value of count to whatever this input is. So we're sending it count plus 1. And this should hopefully, yeah. So this will start re-rendering every time that the state changes. And that's the key thing, that state changes cause re-renders, not variable changes, right? And that's how you use state. So anytime you want a variable to be updating your DOM, your actual output, that's when you use state.
The use state, is that only used for functional?
Yeah, so use state is a hook, and hooks were introduced. This is the main feature that was introduced about a year ago that made functional React possible to this extent. So use state and use effect, which I'll go over in a little bit, were both created specifically to deal with functional React. And so I'll go over what it used to be after like this thing, because I didn't use class-based React too much. I used it for a few months, and then we rewrote everything in functional React because it's like the newer thing.
Is it equivalent to the constructor and the class component though? Since there you can specify this dot state.
Yeah, it's literally the same thing. And then,
but it's just different. Okay.
Yeah, so it's just using functions, because like this function might not have a this if you wrote it as an arrow function. It doesn't have scoping, so this is how you use hooks instead. So yeah, we can go into the use effect hook now, which is another hook which I just learned last weekend, which was pretty interesting, and it solved a pretty big issue I was having. So we're actually going to go into here and import that into our footer. Yeah. Use effect. So use effect is another hook. It's kind of like use state. So in React, there's a bunch of like, and this was very important to know in class-based React, but not so much here. React has a bunch of basic properties, such as will component mount, did component mount, and things like that. And these are like the life cycle of React. So React treats these HTML or JSX elements with some priority about how it renders it. And before and after each step, it gives you an opportunity to run some JavaScript so that you can change things if you need to. Right before a component is about to mount, which means it's about to be rendered, you can use the will component mount. That's right before the component is going to mount. And then did component mount is right after it did mount. Right? So this was in class-based React, but this notion doesn't really exist in functional React because, well, we can't have a bunch of like functions in a class. So the solution to this was the use effect hook. So here we can call use effect, and it takes in two parameters. The first parameter will be a function, so we'll leave that blank for now. And then the second parameter is the dependencies of the hook. So this is another way of writing states if you can't like use state in some scenarios. So for me, this was using the Google Maps API, and there was like some complications, so I couldn't use a state. So I had to use the effect hook. And so inside of here, you can pass in a variable that will update that you want to re-render on that update. So let's say we have let's say we get a new prop called X, right? And we want to have a re-render when X changes. So in here we can, I forgot what I was doing. Let's just open up my code from like this, because it will have a demo in there. What the heck? Apparently I chose to open my there we go. Source, components. Okay, a lot of code here. Just ignore most of it, right? So the bottom line is, so this is the effect here, right? So I wanted to call this function search. So I was using the Google Maps API and it was searching a bunch of locations, right? And I wanted to call this search function anytime any of these three props. So these are coming in from props. So this is fancy JavaScript that you guys don't need to worry about. This is the equivalent of just writing like let research equal props dot research, right? So this is the equivalent of writing this. It's just fancy JavaScript. But anyway, so I wanted to call this a function anytime these three things change. But keeping track of that is difficult. Like, how do you tell when something changes? Use effect. So use effect will do whatever is in here anytime these things change. And search calls, search does state changes. So it updates the state, and that'll cause a re-render. Yeah, that's like the simplest I can get into. Use effect gets a lot more complicated, and it's very versatile because it replaces a lot of things. And it's really more complicated. You guys don't need use effect to do a lot of things until you start dealing with big APIs and stuff. So I guess you guys can leave it. For now, if you guys have more questions about use effect, ping me on Discord because I can look up documentation about it and give you guys proper answers about it. But yeah, that's pretty much React. It's not that complicated. It might look complicated because, again, JSX is HTML. That's the thing that threw me off the longest time. So another quirk of JSX is the single parent property. So inside of each component, you can only return a single parent. So inside of here, right, look at this div tag that wraps around everything inside of it. You have to have this. You can only return one parent element. So if we remove this div tag, then each of these would become their own parent element. And that React doesn't work like that, because React, if you think about it, React is like something synthetic tree behind the scenes. So each tree needs a parent, right? So you need, so that's just a small quirk of JSX. You need to have this parenting property. Yeah, so this is a note on the original React. It was the very first implementation. It's been around for much, much longer than functional React. It's like 5-6 years old now. So a lot of tutorials and a lot of documentation is still on component-based React. Class-based React. And I encourage you guys to use functional React if you can, because I personally think that it's going to slowly take over class-based React. So yeah, this is, you can kind of tell here what class-based React looks like. So you extend a component, you extend a component, you have the component div mount all those event updaters, and you have a render function which will return the JSX, right? Remember, this was just our return at the end. React has server-side rendering. I've never used it. I just know it's possible. If that's something you guys might be interested in, to make things smaller over networks, but usually it's not very popularly used. React Native, you can take everything you just learned in React with a little tiny bit of syntax change, and you can render it into Android and iOS at the same time. So that's really powerful, and I think it's really cool. And then a couple of extra notes for you guys. ReactConf 2019 was a game changer. Like, Facebook is rewriting their entire website, and so they've been working on React a lot with that. So ReactConf 2019, you can search on YouTube. There are really good tutorials and videos that teach you guys about like the cutting edge of React, and it's really cool. Vue.js is a React alternative. It's really interesting. I've used it before. I really like it. You guys should consider Vue. React has a lot more support and a much larger community and more frameworks and APIs and stuff, so that might be the reason for it. Redux, I just used one state, right, in our little demo app. Sometimes you'll start using hundreds of states and passing them around, like down like 20 trees or like 20 components, and that can get quite complicated. So this is where Redux comes in. Redux is a state management. It's pretty much just a giant global variable of all the states that you need, but it's addition to React that you can use. You can also just use it on its own, but it usually comes in with React. A note on Redux, by the way, it's ridiculously complicated and really hard to learn. So unless you're doing a really large app and you need a lot of state, I would recommend you sway away from it. And then Chrome DevTools. Chrome has really, really nice DevTools for React. So if you install the Chrome DevTools, this thing, you can just search it up. You get these nice, like, pre-compiled versions of your components, so it's easier to track things. And yeah, I recommend you use that. It doesn't look like much here, but once you start getting a lot of states and a lot of hooks and bigger apps, it will actually save your lives compared to trying to look through all the HTML that's actually happening behind the scenes. And that's pretty much it. If you guys have questions, ping me in our help channel. You can ping @React, and me or anyone else who knows React will also